York, this is Democracy Now!
We've lost track of the real security needs we face, and we've become obsessed with spending more and more on military weapons that, in fact, have only a minor role to play in the national security of a country.
As President Trump marks the 70th anniversary of NATO with a push for members to increase military spending, we'll speak with Joe Cirincione, president of Plowshares Fund, about how Trump's call will benefit U.S. weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin and Boeing. Then a group of peace activists have entered their second year in pretrial detention for entering the Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base in Georgia to protest U.S. nuclear weapons. We'll speak to the four co-defendants in their first joint interview. The Kings Bay Plowshares 7 face up to 25 years in prison.
We thought it was a good place to call attention to in light of the horrific nature of the Trident system. And we were hoping, too, that this would somehow show our solidarity with the triplets that Martin Luther King spoke of. We wanted to make the connections on the anniversary of King's assassination to militarism, consumerism, and racism.
The Nobel Peace Prize winning South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Daniel Ellsberg, and Noam Chomsky, among others, have just backed a global call for charges to be dropped against the Kings Bay Plowshare 7. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen stepping down. The news was announced by President Trump on Twitter Sunday evening. CNN's reporting Trump ousted Nielsen following months of reported tensions between the two. Nielsen oversaw Trump's zero-tolerance family separation policy and came under fire by Democrats for lying to Congress about the policy, as well as for withholding information on children who died in U.S. custody. In June of last year, Nielsen tweeted, "We do not have a policy of separating families at the border, period." She lied. In a statement, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said, quote, "It is deeply alarming that the Trump administration official who put children in cages is reportedly resigning because she's not extreme enough for the White House's liking." Unquote. Kevin McAleenan, the current U.S. Customs and Border Protection Commissioner, will become the acting head of Homeland Security. On Friday, Trump withdrew nominee Ronald Vitiello to head Immigration and Customs Enforcement, indicating he wasn't tough enough for the role. Meanwhile, immigration and civil rights groups are urging Fortune 500 companies not to hire former Trump administration officials who were involved in separating migrant families and caging children. A letter signed by 41 groups, including the Southern Poverty Law Center, reads, "They should not be allowed to seek refuge in your boardrooms or corner offices. Allowing them to step off of revolving door and into your welcoming arms should be a non-starter," they wrote. The government said Friday it could take as long as 2 years to reunite children who were separated from their families at the southern border as part of Trump's family separation policy. The Trump administration admitted earlier this year they failed to keep proper records on which children in its care had been separated from their parents. Last month, the judge overseeing a lawsuit on behalf of separated families expanded the case to include any children who were separated from their parents as early as July 2017, nearly a year before the official policy took effect, potentially adding thousands of children to the 2,700 cases previously identified. The ACLU, which brought the class action suit against the government, said a 2-year wait could be devastating and that the group would challenge the administration's plan in court. In New York, police arrested and charged a man Friday for threatening to murder Minnesota Congressmember Ilhan Omar. 55-year-old Patrick Carlineo Jr., a vocal Trump supporter who told investigators he loves the president and hates radical Muslims in our government, called Omar's congressional office and delivered an expletive-laden rant saying, "Do you work for the Muslim Brotherhood? Why are you working for her? She's an effing terrorist. I'll put a bullet in her effing skull." He spoke out the words. Congressmember Ilhan Omar is one of the first 2 Muslim women elected to Congress last November and is the only Congress member to wear a hijab. In a statement, the Council on American-Islamic Relations said, quote, "The political environment led by an Islamophobe in the White House has normalized hate speech and emboldened bigots in their actions. The rising threat of Islamophobia and white supremacy must be taken seriously," Kerr said. One day after the arrest, President Trump mocked Congresswoman Omar during a Saturday address before the Republican Jewish Coalition in Las Vegas. Trump pretended to thank Congressmember Omar before quickly adding, "Oh, I forgot. She doesn't like Israel. I'm so sorry." Trump's comments refer to recent accusations of anti-Semitism against the Congressmember, largely fueled by conservatives and pro-Israeli government groups and lawmakers. Trump also attacked migrants seeking asylum in the United States.
Congress must end catch and release so that illegal border crossers can be quickly and safely returned to their home. Get out. Sorry, get out. Sorry, can't handle it. And I told my people yesterday, our country's full. We're full. Our system's full. Our country is full. Can't come in. Our country is full. What can you do? We can't handle anymore. Our country is full.
During his speech, Trump also boasted of the United States' recent recognition of the occupied Golan Heights as sovereign Israeli territory and his decision to move the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Activists from the progressive Jewish anti-occupation group If Not Now disrupted Trump's speech. 10 members of the group chanted, "Jews are here to say the occupation is a plague. Jews are here to say white nationalism is a plague." A Mexican man died last week while in the custody of Immigration and Customs Enforcement in Florence, Arizona, according to officials. 54-year-old Abel Reyes Clemente was found unconscious and not breathing after being transferred from a Maricopa County jail to an ICE processing center in February. Reyes Clemente was in jail on a misdemeanor conviction. He was put under observation after showing flu-like symptoms and died just 2 days later. In Yemen, local authorities reported at least 13 civilians, including at least 7 children, were killed after an air raid on a warehouse in the capital Sana'a Sunday. Another 100 were reportedly injured. Houthi rebels say the Saudi-led airstrikes targeted a weapons storage site that was located close to homes and a school. The U.S.-backed Saudi-led war in Yemen has killed thousands of civilians and sparked the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with 10 million people facing famine. Last week, Congress members joined their colleagues in the Senate to back a war powers resolution calling for an end to U.S. support for the war. President Trump's expected to veto the resolution. On Saturday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he plans to annex Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank if re-elected tomorrow. He made comments on Israel television just days before Tuesday's parliamentary elections, pitting the embattled prime minister against his former army chief of staff, Benny Gantz. Palestinian officials and Palestinian residents of the West Bank condemned the remarks, which many say were made as an appeal to right-wing voters. This is activist Mohammed Zugahar of the group Youth Against Settlements.
It is clear for the world that there is no real partner for peace that Mahmoud Abbas is calling for through negotiations. The Israeli occupation and Netanyahu and his coalition with the extreme right wants to form a big government for settlers that will implement the plan of the century that is led by the American president, Donald Trump.
Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank are considered illegal under international law. In Libya, government officials say 21 people were killed in recent days as fighting intensified near the capital, Tripoli. Last week, a renegade army commander of the Benghazi-based Libyan National Army ordered his forces to advance on the capital in an attempt to topple the country's UN-backed government, the Government of National Accord, or GNA. General Haftar said the LNA carried out airstrikes on Sunday and that his forces had seized an airport near the capital. GNA's armed forces announced a counteroffensive to defend Tripoli. The U.S. has pulled some of its troops from Libya, and the United Nations is warning that thousands of civilians will be displaced from the escalation and violence, while others would be trapped amidst the fighting and cut off from emergency services. In Sudan, protesters say security forces unleashed tear gas and stun grenades on crowds who've been demonstrating outside the military headquarters in the capital, Khartoum, which is also the residence of President Omar al-Bashir. Tens of thousands have taken to the streets since Saturday in one of the largest anti-government protests since the popular uprising demanding al-Bashir's resignation began in December. At least 5 people were reportedly killed across the country over the weekend, and at least 50 people have been killed since December, according to rights groups. The Sudan government has also been accused of jailing hundreds of activists and critics of the president and of shutting down press outlets and barring foreign reporters from covering the protests. Reports on the ground say some soldiers sided with protesters this weekend, signaling a possible loss of military support for the embattled al-Bashir, who's been in power for 3 decades. His current term is due to end in 2020. The Trump administration is preparing to designate Iran's elite Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization, according to recent reports. The move would be the latest in the White House's effort to isolate Iran after the U.S. withdrew from the landmark Iran nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions on Iran last year, despite widespread international condemnation. Iranian officials warn the designation of their military would destabilize the region and draw a retaliatory response from Iran, which could designate the U.S. military as a terrorist group. In Washington state, Motel 6 is settling a lawsuit for $12 million that accused the budget hotel chain of violating anti-discrimination and privacy laws by handing over personal information of hotel guests to ICE. Hotel managers gave personal data, including names, dates of birth, driver's license, and numbers of thousands of guests to immigration officers between 2015 and 2017, according to Washington Attorney General Bob Ferguson. Immigration officials were able to scrutinize the list for, quote, Latino-sounding names, leading to multiple arrests, detentions, and deportations. In Massachusetts, the president of Hampshire College, Miriam Nelson, stepped down Friday after months of student protests against cuts in the school's staff and budget. In January, Nelson announced Hampshire College would not admit a full class in the fall, as well as a plan to merge the school with a strategic partner, leading many to fear the school may either close or lose its independence. Student organizers from the group Hamp Rise Up have been calling on Nelson, as well as other officials and board members, to step down following a vote of no confidence from students. Fundraising campaigns have been set up to keep Hampshire College running in the face of losses from tuition for the coming school year. American Airlines announced it's extending a cancellation on a number of its flights into early June due to the continued removal of the Boeing 737 MAX from service. The cancellations will affect 90 flights a day. Southwest Airlines, which also flies Boeing 737 MAX aircrafts, took similar measures last month. The ongoing disruption in air travel comes as Boeing apologized last week for the fatal crashes of 2 MAX 8 aircrafts in recent months. Last month's Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 and Indonesia's Lion Air 610 in October, which together killed almost 350 people on board. The first American wrongful death lawsuit has been brought, and faulty software is believed to have played a major role in both crashes. And in New York City, activists from over 30 groups took over the prestigious Whitney Museum Friday to call for the removal of Vice Chairman Warren Kanders, CEO of the tear gas manufacturer Safariland, from the museum's board. The protests launched a 9-week series of actions organized by Decolonize This Place. Democracy Now! Spoke to one of the activists at Friday's action.
My name is Mar Safor, and I'm with MTL Plus Collective and Decolonize This Place. Today we're here for week 3 of the 9 weeks of Art in Action at the Whitney Museum, demanding the removal of Vice Chairman Warren Kanders. Warren Kanders is the CEO of Safariland, an international weapons manufacturer who manufactured the tear gas used against migrant families at the border, water protectors in Standing Rock, black folks in Ferguson, Palestine, Oakland, Turkey, Egypt, and the list goes on.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to continue our look at the 70th anniversary of the founding of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The alliance was formed April 4th, 1949. Commemorations as well as protests were held last week to mark the anniversary. President Trump used the anniversary to push for NATO countries to increase military spending. During an Oval Office meeting Tuesday with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, President Trump demanded Germany and other NATO countries increase their military spending from 2 to 4% of GDP.
We've worked together on getting some of our allies to pay their fair share. It's called burden sharing, and as you know, when I came, it wasn't so good, and now they're catching up. We have 7 of the 28 countries are currently current. And the rest are trying to catch up, and they will catch up. And some of them have no problems because they haven't been paying and they're very rich. But we're looking at the 2% of GDP level. And at some point, I think it's going to have to go higher than that. I think probably it should be higher.
The push for more military spending could benefit U.S. weapons manufacturers, including Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and others. This comes as acting Pentagon Chief Patrick Shanahan is under investigation for improperly advocating on behalf of Boeing, where he worked for more than 30 years. For more on this, we continue our conversation with Joe Cirincione, who I spoke to on Friday, the president of Plowshares Fund, a global security foundation, author of Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late, and Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons. I began by asking him to respond to President Trump's demands that NATO countries spend even more on military weapons rather than education and health care, what some might say are the true markers of national security in a country.
We're cursed in this discussion by a very narrow definition of national security. We've all come to accept that national security equals military forces and weapons, when in fact, as you point out, a national security is more often determined by the health and welfare of its citizenry, the system of justice, whether citizens feel that they're engaged in the country and have a role in the governance of that country. And spending on military is just one small part of national security, but this has become the test of whether a country is carrying its fair burden. So burden sharing with NATO countries has been an issue in this town for decades. Republicans and Democrats have both harped on it because it's kind of an easy way for them to show that they're tough, that they're strong. But let's put this in perspective. What are we talking about here? The world as a whole every year spends about $1.7 trillion on military weapons and forces. 1.7. The United States and our NATO allies account for 1 trillion of that. So more than half of all global spending is spent by the United States and our NATO allies. The NATO allies alone account for about $240 billion. That's what they spend. What are they spending it to guard against? Well, if you think that Russia is the main threat, Russia only spends about $66 billion every year on defense. In fact, its spending dropped by 20% between 2016 and 2017, the last year we have figures for. So its spending is going down. So why this demand for the NATO allies to spend more when they're beset with all kinds of problems that have nothing to do with military, all kinds of internal economic, immigration problems, social justice problems, health and welfare problems? Why? Well, one, it's simple. The 2% solution, it's a simple mantra that is repeated. And two, this directly benefits military contractors. Who makes the money off of this? Well, most of the money that we spend in this country on defense and that the Europeans spend go to a relative handful of defense contractors, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, et cetera. And they lobby incessantly for these kind of increases in Washington, in NATO headquarters, in the capitals of Europe. And now we have the absurd situation where a 31-year veteran of Boeing, a corporate executive, Patrick Shanahan, is the acting Secretary of Defense. I mean, this is such an obvious conflict of interest. You would think that people would say, well, no, you can't do that. But, of course, this is Trump's Washington, where oil industry executives are running the EPA and pharmaceutical companies run the FDA. So it's become accepted, but it's not right. It's not fair, and it distorts us, and it's dangerous. Just one last fact. if you take Trump at his word that he wants them to contribute 4%, well, that means you want Europe to double their defense spending from about $230 billion to $460 billion. For what? To do what? Where does this go towards? We've lost track of the real security needs we face, and we've become obsessed with spending more and more on military weapons that, in fact, have only a minor role to play in the national security of a country.
I want to go back to Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General. How unusual is it, Joe, that he addressed a joint session of Congress? Let's play the clip of this moment.
NATO allies must spend more on defense. This has been the clear message from President Trump, and this message is having a real impact. After years of reducing defense budgets, all allies have stopped the cuts, and all allies have increased their defense spending.
All allies have increased their defense spending. Jens Stoltenberg, after meeting with President Trump in the White House, boasting of Trump's influence. I mean, think back, Joe Cirincione, to the beginning of the Trump term when he was slamming NATO and now claiming credit for them all pouring money into weapons purchases. Has NATO caved to President Trump?
Well, they certainly have, I guess, caved rhetorically. The actual figures are not quite as rosy as the Secretary General states. For example, Germany has slightly increased its defense spending, but it's not going to come anywhere close to 2%. So it's technically true, but what he's basically doing is trying to come and repair the rift in the NATO alliance that President Trump has caused. This is not a European problem. This is an American problem. The President of the United States is causing this division, almost unprecedented in the 70 years of NATO history. So this is why he wanted to come. And it's very, I don't think a Secretary General has ever addressed a joint session of Congress. And he's coming because the European allies are worried about the health of the alliance, not primarily because of defense spending, but because about the attitudes and policies and temperament of the President of the United States. So he's going directly to Congress to solidify these ties. And in the course of that, he's trying to appease the president by saying, yes, Mr. President, your demand for increased spending is happening. He's stroking Trump the way, unfortunately, our allies have come to believe they have to do in order to maintain good ties. Was it successful? It was successful. But unfortunately, I think in so doing, he feeds into the military spending frenzy that has seized Congress. When he made that statement, he got a standing ovation. Democrats and Republicans stood up and applauded more defense spending. And this is what's happening in this country. The president has submitted a budget for $750 billion for military spending, $750 billion, a big jump from the approximately $720 that we were spending last year. What do the Democrats do? They say, well, we're not going to give you $750. We offer $736. That's their plan, $736. So both Republicans and Democrats, unfortunately, are feeding into this frenzy to spend more and more on weapons at the expense of domestic expenditures.
Joe, you've written several books, one of them, Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late, and Bomb Scare, the History and Future of Nuclear Weapons. Do you think it's too late? And what do you think needs to happen?
All the arrows are pointing in the wrong direction. So nuclear storm clouds are gathering. For example, John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, has been very successful in sabotaging talks with North Korea. The one benefit of the Trump presidency might be that he could negotiate a solid deal with Kim Jong-un. It now appears, according to reports this week, that at the Hanoi summit, John Bolton sabotaged those talks by presenting a list of unacceptable demands, an all-or-nothing offer to the North Koreans that caused them to call off the talks. he has killed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This is a Ronald Reagan treaty that successfully pulled out and destroyed 3,000 nuclear weapons from Europe. You may have been covering this in the 80s, Amy, when we were pouring nuclear weapons into Europe, massive demonstrations. The biggest rift in the NATO alliance until this point was that crisis. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev negotiated a treaty. Bolton never liked it. He killed it. And why did he kill it? He used the excuse of a Russian violation, which I believe is real, but the kind of thing that can be fixed within the treaty framework. But why did they kill it? Because there are elements in the U.S. military and the defense industry that want to build new nuclear weapons that were prohibited by that treaty to deploy against China and to put in to Europe. So weeks after we announced we were withdrawing from the treaty, it was revealed that the Department of Defense is starting manufacturing, research and development and production of a new ground-launched cruise missile, a so-called GLICM. You may remember this phrase from the 80s. It was GLICMs and Pershing IIs that we were pouring into Europe. And so Secretary General Stoltenberg sought to assure the Congress that NATO would not accept a new Intermediate Nuclear Forces nuclear weapon in Europe. So Bolton is doing this a little cleverly. It's like a Trojan horse. It's going to be a conventionally armed ground-launched cruise missile, a conventionally armed GLICM that will go into Europe, perhaps in the next couple of years. But of course, you can easily swap out the conventional warhead for a nuclear warhead. So I think they're planning to put these weapons in to avoid the kind of mass demonstrations and later possibly equip them with nuclear weapons. This is the kind of Cold War policy that we thought was behind us. We thought the arms race was over. It's not over. We are in a new arms race. Every single nuclear-armed country is building new nuclear weapons and heading towards a confrontation point. You got to be a real optimist to think that you can keep thousands of nuclear weapons in fallible human hands indefinitely and something terrible is not going to happen. I am very worried about the direction of the arms race, the direction of our policies.
Joe Cirincione, president of Plowshares Fund, author of Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late, and Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons. To see part one of our interview, go to DemocracyNow.org. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
I'd freak out like 2 times a week. I don't have a plan. I'm living on my dreams. In my dreams there's a street, there's a man in the street. He's holding the street in his hand.
Young Boys with Loaded Machines by Jolie Rickman. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A group of activists have been jailed for over a year before trial for entering the Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base in Georgia last April to protest U.S. nuclear weapons. The action took place April 4th, 2018, the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. Armed with hammers, crime scene tape, baby bottles containing their own blood, 7 anti-nuclear activists secretly entered Kings Bay, one of the largest nuclear submarine bases in the world, under the cover of night. Their goal was to symbolically disarm the 6 nuclear ballistic missile submarines kept there. Each submarine carries 20 Trident thermonuclear weapons. 1 year after this historic action, 3 of the Plowshares activists remain jailed in Georgia. The other 4 are out on $50,000 bond with electronic ankle monitors. All 7 face up to 25 years in prison. They've been charged with 3 felonies and a misdemeanor. On Thursday, global leaders, activists, and scholars, including the Nobel Prize-winning former South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Daniel Ellsberg, and Noam Chomsky, released a petition addressed to U.S. Attorney General William Barr demanding all charges against the Kings Bay 7 be dropped immediately. The petition reads in part, quote, "We who share the moral vision of the Kings Bay Plowshares 7 proclaim our support for their courage and sustained sacrifice sacrifice and call for the immediate dismissal of all charges against them, unquote. The Kings Bay protest builds on a history of similar anti-nuclear plowshares actions around the world, beginning in 1980 in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. That first Plowshares Act was led by the late Father Daniel and Philip Berrigan. Phil's widow, Liz McAllister, is one of the 7 arrested last April. She remains locked up alongside Jesuit priest Stephen Kelly and Mark Colville in Brunswick, Georgia. I recently sat down with the 4 Plowshares activists who are out on bond. Martha Hennessy is the granddaughter of Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. Carmen Trotta helps run the St. Joseph Catholic Worker House here in New York. And Patrick O'Neill is the co-founder of a Catholic worker house in Garner, North Carolina. Claire Grady is a member of the Ithaca, New York Catholic Worker. They joined us in our New York studio for their first joint interview since being arrested. I started by asking Patrick O'Neill to take us back to that night of April 4th, 2018.
Well, the 7 of us cut a lock and got into the naval station, Kings Bay. We had already done our homework. And
where is Kings Bay?
It's in St. Mary's, Georgia, right on the Florida-Georgia border. And the sub base was the baby of Jimmy Carter. He's the one that brought that nuclear system to southeast Georgia. And so we cut a lock and we went in, and we were together for probably about an hour, and then we split into 3 groups, and we had already planned to go to separate places. So Carmen and Liz McAllister and Steve Kelly went to the bunkers where nuclear warheads are stored. Martha and Claire went to the headquarters of the facility, and Mark Colville and I went to what we call the shrine, but it was actually statues of nuclear weapons surrounded by flags coming up out of the ground, many, many of them.
And why did you choose that site to perform this, to engage in this Plowshares action? Well,
it seemed absurd that we would have a shrine to nuclear weapons. In North Carolina, where I live, we're taking down Confederate monuments. But here we had monuments, literally phallic monuments, that were actually replicas of weapons of mass destruction surrounded by flags, including the U.S. flag. And I thought, this is the most incredible example of modern-day idolatry we could find, maybe on planet Earth. And it was the responsibility to smash idols. So that's why we went there.
And what did you particularly do? You went with...
Well, it was Mark Colville and I, and we went to the monument, and I had gotten some hammers from Shea Claiborne from the Simple Way that were made from melted down guns, and I went running up to the monument of the D5 missile, which is the Trident missile that is the most insidious, deadliest weapon ever made in the history of humanity. A first strike, accurate within 100 yards, nuclear weapon, and I went running up to it with the hopes that my hammer would put a hole in it, but when I hit it, it went, oh, and it was made of cement, and the hammerhead broke off. So it was a strong idol.
And then what?
We threw blood on the insignia of the base and also on the missile replicas, and hammered on some of the stuff around there.
And why this base in particular?
Well, oddly enough, even though that base has been there for 30 years, I mean, it was loaded with the nuclear warheads back in the late 80s. There had been a huge action at Cape Canaveral in 1987 when the bombs were being flight tested, and Dr. Spock and it was 5,000 people went down there to oppose the flight testing of the D5 missiles at that time. But even after that 30 years, the Trident base had very little resistance from the community down there, not like out in Washington State, where the other Trident base is, in Kitsap, where there's always been a lot of ongoing resistance. There just had never really been much happening here, and we thought it was a good place to call attention to in light of the horrific nature of the Trident system. And we were hoping, too, that this would somehow show our solidarity with the triplets that Martin Luther King spoke of. We wanted to make the connections on the anniversary of King's assassination to militarism, consumerism, and racism. So we wanted to just, I guess, what we call educate the base.
Claire Grady, talk about why you made this decision to engage in this. You faced years in prison.
Thanks, Amy. I had been part of a Plowshares action in the 80s, 1983, with the Griffiths Plowshares with Liz McAllister and 6 other friends.
And Griffiths was?
At Griffiths Air Force Base, where they had the cruise missile being, well, B-52 bombers that had been used in Vietnam with payload of death. But now, at that point, it was being re-outfitted to carry first strike cruise missiles. So the doomsday clock was 3 minutes to midnight, and these first strike weapons were a big part of that. So as a young woman in my 20s, I was very conscious of this, the omnicidal weapons of that time. Now, in 2018, well, last April, the compelling reason for me
and that was in Griffiths is in Rome, New York.
Griffiths was in Rome, New York. Yes, Griffiths is in Rome, New York. And I lived about an hour and a half from there in Ithaca, New York, in Cayuga Territory.
How many years did you serve for that action?
We were facing the charge of sabotage, which carried 25 years. But we were acquitted of that charge after a 5-week trial, jury trial, and I got a 2-year sentence in federal prison, and I served my time in Alderson, West Virginia, at the Women's Federal Prison. But now I'm 60 years old now, but at this point, I really see and understand how these weapons are not just omnicidal. If they're launched, they're deadly now, every day. And so I see them as the capstone to the systems of violence from the top down to the police gun in the street that kills and threatens to kill, but that these weapons are the bully stick that's used in the same way that a gun is used when it's held to the head of someone. Even if you don't pull that trigger, you're using that gun. So we're using these weapons every day. And I'm not just concerned about if they're launched, but how they're used every day in a way that's, my friend Poco says, to extort. So they are the enforcement mechanism that's necessary to enforce these systems of white supremacy and global capitalism, is how I see it. And so going to Kings Bay with my friends was my way of withdrawing my consent from that system.
And so what exactly did you do along with Martha?
So Martha and I went to the administration building, Swift Atlantic, and we put up crime scene tape at the front of the door. So this is in the middle of the night, and yet there are people parked in the parking lot working inside that building. We didn't go inside the building, but we chose to put up this crime scene tape in the front, put up the indictment indicting for war crimes from the chain of command, the head of the base, the commander of that base, up to the president for war crimes. We brought Daniel Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine, which is Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. It's as in-depth as you can get about our nuclear war policy from back in the 50s and 60s. So we brought these things as evidence to show why there is an urgency, why is there not just a right but a necessity for us to disarm our first strike, first world nuclear weapons. Then we brought a small amount of our blood. We poured that on the ground at the entranceway, and we brought spray paint, and we spray painted disarm, trident, love one another, and a few other things.
And how did you get caught?
So nobody was coming in and out of that entrance, so we chose to go over to where Patrick and Mark were disarming at that shrine that Patrick just described, and we were there for probably an hour in plain visibility of the security guards that were driving back and forth. And at that point, we realized that they were much more interested in arresting, well, Carmen, Liz, and Steve went to the bunkers, which was a really highly secure area with deadly force. So they did not even look at us until they finished that arrest.
And Claire, why did you do this on the anniversary of Dr. King's assassination?
Well, for me, it's been really important. Identify the triplets that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King identifies of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are the key things that work together all the time together. Not one by itself, but all together make a deadly, deadly combination. And so Dr. King is known for many, many things. But I feel like he's been stripped of many of his messages and life's purpose. And so I want to honor what he gave us in that moment.
Martha Hennessy, you, together with Claire, engaged in this particular action at that site, but together with the 7 activists, participated in this Plowshares action. Again, you're the granddaughter of Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. For people who aren't familiar with it, explain what the Catholic Worker Movement is about, why you, as Catholics, did this.
The Catholic Worker Movement began in 1933, under the duress of the Great Depression. And Dorothy, of course, was a journalist. And Peter Morin, the other founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, instructed her in the Catholic social teaching. And so the newspaper was there to be the voice of the people on the street who were voiceless. And since then, it has grown into a movement. It's into its 85th year. And there are perhaps 200 communities around the United States and around the world. They call themselves Catholic workers. And we minister to the poor. We practice the works of mercy, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked. And Dorothy died in 1980, and we continue to try and walk in those footsteps of the disciples and of Dorothy.
And so your decision to engage in this action, have you engaged in one before?
No, never.
So this is a major decision you've made in your life?
Yes, with some trepidation regarding the Catholic Worker Movement and the Plowshares Movement and the two trajectories of those movements.
What was your trepidation?
The whole question of nonviolence and secrecy. I mean, Dorothy and Gandhi and King all operated in a different way. They weren't sneaking onto U.S. military bases. And so my trepidation was what we did have to undergo to make this action possible. And I had to go through a disarmament process of myself. The war in my own heart is always just under the surface. And this was part of my faith journey. And the people that I was able to be with and to do this action with made all the difference to me.
And what stands out most for you about that action, what you remember as the 7 of you went on to this base on the anniversary of King's assassination, with your own blood, with hammers?
Well, the utter fear in my heart of walking in the dark, to challenge the greatest, most violent force on earth, my own government and its military. And that was in great contrast to the man who arrested us, who was incredibly kind, incredibly professional, incredibly considerate. And he even began to tell us about losing a child in its infancy. And the combination of this dreadful, dreadful place and this man who worked at the base, his humanity just became so clear to me in that setting. So the combination of great fear and great love.
I want to turn to the words of the late Father Dan Berrigan, who helped launch the international anti-nuclear Plowshares movement with his brother, Phil. Phil, of course, was the husband of Liz McAllister. Liz is his widow. Dan Berrigan and 7 others poured blood and hammered on warheads at a GE nuclear missile plant, Dan, Phil, and others, in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. I asked Father Berrigan about this during an interview I did with him in 2006.
We went in with the workers at the changing of the shift and found there was really no security worth talking about. Very easy entrance. In about 3 minutes, we were looking at doomsday. The weapon was before us. It was an unarmed warhead about to be shipped to Amarillo, Texas for its payload. So it was a harmless weapon as of that moment. And we cracked the weapon. It was very fragile. It was made to withstand the heat of re-entry into the atmosphere from outer space. So it was like eggshell, really. And we had taken as our motto the great statement of Isaiah 2, they shall beat their swords into plowshares. So we did it, poured our blood around it, and stood in a circle, I think reciting the Lord's Prayer until Armageddon arrived, as we expected.
That was the late Father Dan Berrigan talking about the action they took back in the 80s. This is during the Reagan Bush years at King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, which really launched the modern-day U.S. plowshares movement. Carmen, you were a dear friend of Father Dan Berrigan. This also was your first action, though you have been a leader of the Catholic worker movement in New York City for decades. And talk about the decision you made to engage in this action, now facing years in jail.
I could mention that I was a part of 3 prior Plowshares Action Development groups and wasn't able myself to go forth with those actions. And I really put it off for a very long time. So it's 30 years later or thereabouts when it comes back around to me, or 20 years later. A great deal of it had to do with the community that had gathered. So many of them coming out of the Catholic worker. These were dear friends. 4 of the 7 of us went to Guantanamo together. So we'd been
to protest
U.S. militarism, protest the torture going on at Guantanamo at the time. There was a prisoner strike back in 2005. And so to walk into the room and see the people, once I had decided to explore it again, to see the people that were there was phenomenally compelling. Also, all of this occurs in the context of all those years at the Catholic worker. There is war, and there is war, and there is war, and we are 17 years at war in Afghanistan. And so all of our work, all of our other protests in the city had been seemingly easily dismissed. Every arrest in the city led to, the only punishment that they gave you was that you went to court 6 times, and they would never actually give you a trial, and then they would dismiss the case. But they made you come to court 6 times over the period of a year. And so this is the taproot of violence, really, the nuclear system. The Berrigans pointed that out pretty early. And we could not have chosen, in a certain way, a better time to do it, given the nature of the weapon systems now and the pulling out of the treaties, the INF Treaty, and if we pull out of the START Treaty, my understanding is nuclear weapons will be entirely unregulated for the first time since 1972.
Carmen Trotta of Kings Bay Plowshares. We'll be back with him and his co-defendants after break. They face up to 20 years in prison for entering a U.S. nuclear submarine base in Kings Bay, Georgia. This is Democracy Now! Back in 30 seconds. We Will Rise by Colleen Katow. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we continue our conversation with 4 members of the Kings Bay Plowshares 7 who face up to 25 years in prison for breaking into the Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base in Georgia last year to protest nuclear weapons. I recently spoke with Patrick O'Neill, Carmen Trotta, Martha Hennessy, and Claire Grady in their first joint interview since being arrested. They're out on $50,000 bond each while they await federal trial. They're all required to wear electronic ankle monitors. I asked Martha Hennessy, the granddaughter of Dorothy Day, about the conditions of their release.
We're all on curfew. We spent the first 2 months on house arrest, and we were only allowed to go out with a schedule dictated by the parole officer related to 5 criteria. And now it's curfew.
And I would like to point out that...
Patrick O'Neill.
Yeah, I would like to point out that the primary use of these ankle monitors in the United States now is for undocumented people. It's a very, very oppressive system. The ankle monitors hurt. They're used to track people. It's a very sophisticated form of imprisonment. And in fact, many people are sentenced to house arrest and have to wear these ankle monitors. So we're serving a sentence, in essence, and I don't want to make it in any comparison to what Mark and Steve and Liz are going through because we've been in the jail. But the point is, this is a very oppressive advance in the technology used to oppress people, and especially people of color, especially the poor. So our suffering is minimalistic compared to how it's being used all over the country.
Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow, talks about e-carceration and the dangers of this kind of digital incarceration. But it does mean you can be outside of prison for the moment. Liz McAllister, the widow of Phil Berrigan, Liz McAllister has been in jail for almost a year now. She celebrated her, if you can call it celebrating, her 79th birthday in jail. Steve Kelly turned 70 in jail, and there's Mark Colville. So how did you all decide to leave jail and they decide to remain? Talk about the decision you made.
So I very much think, Amy, that the time in jail, time in court is also part of the witness, just as much as going to Kings Bay. And so I had actually planned or intended to stay in, but my health was deteriorating, and that's really important. The jail, we were in Camden County Jail for the first 5 weeks of our time, and then we were in Glynn County Jail. And I got out in the middle of July. I have low blood pressure usually, and it started going really high. And I thought, I'm getting blood clots, and the food was off, like all jail food is. I've been in prison and jail, but I was feeling like I actually want to get out alive right now. And
are you communicating with the other prisoners at this time?
So we are, and yesterday we had a really sobering conversation with Mark Colville, who got out because he had a cancerous growth that developed on his nose while he was in. And I can't say enough about the health care, the lack of health care in prison, and lack of anything. And so Mark just reiterated all that for us on the phone yesterday in his little 15-minute call from the jail. There's little movement, little outside, little access to a library, no access to good food, even on commissary. And so if you're there for any extended time, and he was describing one friend who had had a stroke and another friend who had died of a heart attack, people that were in their 30s. So it can't be said enough, and all of us, as we seek to abolish nuclear weapons, completely connect that prison abolition and jail, all of this incarceration is part of the same system that we seek to abolish. So,
I wanted to ask you, Patrick, about the legal strategy you're going to use in court, the theory that you're going to apply using the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Talk about your case.
Well, I guess I would say it's in a holding pattern right now. We've been dealing with these pretrial motions now, since May. And I'd like to think that we've sort of flummoxed the federal government a little bit, because the Religious Freedom Restoration Act has primarily been used in administrative cases or civil cases and not so much criminal cases, but also it has been used frequently by people on the right to, the case in which Hobby Lobby won. They used
Explain.
Well, they were challenging Hobby Lobby, the corporation was challenging their that they didn't want to provide insurance for birth control, for example, and they used the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to claim it as a religious right, and they won. But it's also been used by others. A man who was not allowed to have a beard. He was Muslim, and he won.
Jail.
He was in jail, and yes, right, important point. And he won using the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So it's pretty unique now that some of our lawyers who are helping us, most of us are representing ourselves, but with standby counsel, and many, many other lawyers helping to write briefs and to do this background work, a talented group of lawyers from around the country. And the idea came up, how would you guys like to look at the Religious Freedom Restoration Act for us? So it turned out that when we initially told the government we wanted to pursue this, they were sort of caught off guard and didn't do their homework, and they kind of blew it off. And what the magistrate realized was that the U.S. attorney had made a tactical mistake in not taking this seriously. In many ways, if you look at the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, it almost trumps the First Amendment. It really gives a lot of...
How does it apply in your case?
Well, it applies because the criteria is that you have to have a religious belief that is sincerely held, and you also have to show that you've been burdened by the government's reaction to what you've done, and that that this burden is limiting your practice of your religion. Well, of course, as Claire mentioned, and everyone else, our whole religious symbolism going into the base was clear. It was documented in our statement. It was documented by the blood. It was documented by Scripture, by the Bible, by the spray painting of the religious Scripture quotes.
And it was?
They shall beat their swords into plowshares, like Dan Berrigan said in the previous interview. So we really did establish a case that our religious beliefs were sincerely held. So then the government ended up having to grant us oral argument on this, in which we brought in Janine Hill Fletcher, a theologian at Fordham, who came all the way down to Georgia. And what was the bishop's name?
Joseph Kopatz from Jackson, Mississippi.
Jackson, Mississippi. So we were able to call witnesses, which is absolutely unprecedented in the 39 years of plowshare history, to make our case that these weapons are illegal and immoral. And the hearings were absolutely astounding in the content, because not only were our two expert witnesses able to speak, but all of us were to speak about our religious convictions and make all the arguments that Claire just made about the immorality of these weapons.
And where did that hearing go?
Well, it went over 2 days in November, and we are actually still waiting for the government's response. And one of our lawyers here in New York, Vern Walker, he's in Westchester County, he met with us the day before yesterday, and he said, the Holy Spirit has hijacked your case. But he really thinks that the government is really taking their time because they're worried. They don't really want a court precedent that would be in favor of us.
Mm-hmm. And how does this, using the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, relate to what's often used, Martha Hennessy, and that is the necessity defense, and explain what that is?
Well, the necessity defense has been something that the plowshares movement has attempted to use all of these decades and has essentially been stripped of that. That if you are walking past a burning house and there's a child inside, you have the right to break down the door and rescue the child. And so we would like to bring forth to the federal courts expert testimony to show that the necessity defense and the international law defense are relevant in this case, and that has been obstructed for the past 36 years. We need expert testimony on the legality of the nuclear weapons.
How much time do you face in jail?
Oh, they say that the counts against us are good for 10 years each, depredation of property, destruction of property, conspiracy, and then, of course, the misdemeanor of trespass, which is up to 6 months.
So the number of years you're all facing?
I think it was 25 is how I remember.
And are you prepared to serve years in jail?
I'm 63. I am facing maybe 20 years left of my life. And this is all, my personal life is irrelevant compared to the creation of God being destroyed. So
the weapons of empire are always the threat of death and torture and incarceration and dehumanization. And so when we undertake this as white people of privilege, we are just adding a little tiny bit to what is ongoing of the struggle of people, where the doomsday clock has already hit midnight for them, and their children, and their grandchildren, and the earth where they live. But I think that what we want to do, or I want to do, and we want to do, is be invitational to other people with similar privilege to say that we enjoy these privileges. We're not really enjoying it. There's just tremendous cost that comes with all this. But that in stepping over that line and taking that hammer and actually hammering a dent in some of these weapon systems, that they give you this 25-year threat, but you don't know what the outcome is, and that the whole process is to encourage each other to walk in love and not fear.
Claire Grady of the Kings Bay Plowshare 7, along with Patrick O'Neill, Carmen Trotta, and Martha Hennessy, whose grandmother, Catholic worker co-founder Dorothy Day, is being considered for sainthood by the Catholic Church. The Kings Bay Plowshare 7 face up to 25 years in prison for entering a U.S. nuclear submarine base last year in Georgia. 3 of their co-defendants remain in jail. The Nobel Peace Prize-winning South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Daniel Ellsberg, Noam Chomsky, and others have just backed a global call for charges to be dropped against them. That does it for our show. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.